Today, given that we are at the start of a new year and in the holiday season, we should talk about how lucky we are to be in this nation and how great we have it. And it's not just the material bounty that we have. It's about the freedom that provides us the opportunity to pursue our happiness however we define it. This is the exception in the history of mankind. The standard in world history, and this isn't just historically, look at a map today. Look at the governments and where the largest population centers in this world exist. Freedom is the exception. It is darkness almost over the entire globe. And that actually is what is normal in the history of mankind. The standard is that you live as a serf under a lord, or as a slave under a slave master, or in a gulag nation, like what North Korea is today. Look at a world map. Study world history. The reason history is so important, in part, is so that we appreciate the fruits of what we have in this nation. Billions of people throughout human history, and including today, have only known totalitarianism and an oppressive state, where if you have any rights, you really do have crumbs, like Nancy Pelosi likes to say, and they can be snatched from you at any time. Rule of law, non-existent, could be gone tomorrow. Property rights, what are property rights in many nations? Take the case of Venezuela, for example. In 2001, Venezuela was South America's richest country. Now it's a failed state. It is literally like Iraq when you look at what the metrics are in terms of economics and crime, the collapse. All due to bad ideas. Bad ideas can take everything that you've built up over centuries and destroy them. Amazingly, one of the benefits that we've had in America from our success, much of which we've taken for granted, and few people even think about all of the necessary steps that it took to get to this place today. One of the benefits is that we have it so good that we can take time to explore all the flaws within our nation. We can focus on those flaws to such a degree that we end up tearing at the very fabric that made us into what we are. It's an amazing thing. People have never had things so good, and they want to throw this experiment into the trash bin of history. I should tell you, I have a child on the way right now. That'll be one of the New Year's gifts. I could be called out of this show at any minute, potentially, as a result of where we are right now. And as a future first-time parent, one of the things that you think about is, what kind of world are you going to bring your child into? How do you inculcate them with the beliefs, the values, and principles that you want to dominate in this world? You know, part of it is protecting them, but they also have to live in a reality. And what is the reality today? Well, the reality today is that among our elite, the ideas that trickle down and percolate into society are completely antithetical to the ones on which this nation was based. And in a sense, what you have is progressive agitprop, progressive propaganda. It's in government and in the bureaucracy, which is its own branch of government, even though it's not treated as such. It's in the media, and it's in our education system. You have highly credentialed people, but not necessarily wise people. They're intelligent people, but their intelligence leads them to believe they can perfect society, that they have a moral duty to try to perfect society through wielding the power of the state, to nudge us deplorables, as Cass Sunstein, Obama regulatory czar, once put it, to nudge us deplorables towards the right answer. But who are they to make that decision over us? Why is that the morally right thing to do? They would argue, essentially, they're morally superior. As virtue signalers and as holders of these values and principles, they should be the ones to point us in the right direction. And what is the impact of these bad ideas? Well, I mentioned they destroyed Venezuela in a very short period of time, in under 2 decades. Bad ideas took the richest nation in South America and destroyed it. But those ideas have seeped in here as well. And people look at campus craziness and they kind of shrug it off as well. This is just young people, immature. It's crazy, ivory tower sort of stuff. And when they get out into the real world and see the percentage of tax dollars taken out of their smaller paychecks, then they start to see, oh my gosh, there actually are some pretty negative consequences for me and my family and my future. But it's about much more than just economics, because economics are an outgrowth of our belief system. Free market economics are an outgrowth of a system of values and principles, Judeo-Christian Western values and principles, and that free market capitalist system springs from them. It's the result of them. But that's not the end. That's just one of the benefits. There was a recent poll put out by the Foundation for Liberty and American Greatness /YouGov, and it was called the State of American Patriotism Report. They polled 1,100 people, a bit under 50% of them between 14 and 37 years old, folks. So we're talking millennials and premillennials and maybe a little bit of Gen Xers as well. Here were some of the findings from that survey. Half of those surveyed believe the United States is sexist and racist. American exceptionalism is on the decline, according to the report. 46% of younger Americans do not agree that, quote unquote, America is the greatest country in the world. 38% of younger Americans do not agree that, quote, America has a history that we should be proud of. 1 in 8, 14% of millennials agree. America was never a great country and it never will be. So that is the future Andrew Cuomo constituency. 46% of younger Americans agree that America is more racist than other countries. I got to tell you, these people have never been to any other country, probably. It's absolutely mind-numbing, both the ignorance and the arrogance. The ignorance to not know and the arrogance to put forth these sorts of views, not knowing anything about them. 84% of Americans do not know the specific rights enumerated in the First Amendment. So how can they be counted on to defend that First Amendment when they don't even know what it is or why it existed in the first place? 19% of millennials believe that the American flag is a quote-unquote sign of intolerance and hatred. My God. 44% of younger Americans believe Barack Obama had a quote-unquote bigger impact on America than George Washington. So that is what young Americans get out of our education system, out of our media. I mean, you got to give the left credit. At least with Alexander Hamilton, people know a little bit about him. So you have this ignorant, arrogant, young population in America, and that is our future. The bad ideas have consequences. If people hate the very values and principles on which a country is based, how can they be counted on to defend them, to promulgate them to their kids? And we're talking multiple generations of this kind of propaganda. So naturally, in Axios last night, there was an article titled "The Coming Reckoning for Capitalism." A quote from that article. One of the most important trends likely to drive the 2020 presidential race, a growing disillusion with capitalism as practice, and a coming struggle over how to recast this pillar of the Western order. And you know, it's funny. These people like to talk about how Trump is a threat to Western civilization, yet they're the ones that want to throw out the very principles on which Western civilization derives. The article goes on. The bottom line, you could hardly challenge a more basic part of who we are as Americans and Westerners. Polling shows a rising number of young Americans prefer socialism to capitalism. Now, I would question whether or not they can define what socialism is and what capitalism is. So the fact that they have an opinion on it is, I would say, questionable to begin with. But that's staggering, because if we won the Cold War, how can it be that half the country believes in socialism over capitalism among the youth? That is a direct failure on the part of those who run our institutions, who are supposed to be the ones safeguarding what this country is based on. And the article continues, that's a 12-point decline in young adults' positive views of capitalism in just the past 2 years, and a marked shift since 2010 when 68% viewed it positively. We're talking about 14 to 37-year-old folks, millennials, 18 to 29-year-olds. But it starts way before they're even in college, this sort of propagandizing and effectively brainwashing people. And there's something very sick about that. So there was a Wall Street Journal editorial that caught my eye recently. It's titled Reading from Left to Left at Barnes & Noble. And it goes on to talk about a display at Barnes & Noble that this journalist saw called, quote-unquote, Inspiring Books to Empower Young Readers. What inspires and empowers young readers? Well, the collection included First Generation, 36 Trailblazing Immigrants and Refugees Who Make America Great, which lionizes, among others, Univision anchorman Jorge Ramos and the first fashion model to wear a hijab. The article goes on. There were 3 memoirs by illegal aliens, 2 novels whose protagonists were refugees, Sonia Sotomayor's, Supreme Court Justice, Turning Pages, My Life Story, and We Rise, We Resist, We Raise Our Voices, an anthology that includes a fictional story of a child who is arrested by immigrations and custom enforcement agents at school as he endures taunts from white classmates wearing Make America Great Again hats. Who writes this stuff up? I mean, this is not The Onion. This is a Barnes & Noble display. These are the books that are pushed on our kids. The article goes on. One Portlandia-esque title, You Are Mighty, A Guide to Changing the World, is billed as a how-to manual on being an activist. It features Genesis Palacio, a preteen girl wearing a vegan power t-shirt who became a vegetarian when she was 3 after learning that quote-unquote animals were killed for her food. Apparently, according to the article, Barnes & Noble stores in other cities have similar displays. The chain's corporate office didn't answer the emails of the author. And the article concludes, conservative-themed children's books are out there, but you have to seek out these subversive titles like pornography before the internet. Liberals are devoted to diversity, but they define it in a particular way, obsessing over race, sex, and sexual orientation while demanding conformity of thought, unquote. Let me tell you, as a future father, I recently received a book. My family received a book by someone who did not know where I stood on the ideological spectrum. I kid you not, it's called A is for Activist. This is a picture book. I'll quote a bit from it, and then we'll go to a quick break. Letter E, equal rights, black, brown, or white, clean and healthy is a right. Every place we live and play, environmental justice is the way. Letter J, J is for justice, yay for justice. Juanita, Jamal, justice for the janitors, justicia for all. Letter O, this is a great one. Open minds operate best. Critical thinking over tests. Wisdom can't be memorized. Educate, agitate, organize. Now tell me where our response to a book like that is, because I don't think there's A is for America is exceptional. B is for borders and national sovereignty. C is for capitalism and creative destruction. That would be laughed out of the bookstore. But the other side is propagandizing with picture books for young, impressionable children who cannot conceivably grapple with any of these sorts of ideas. It's unimaginable that there's anything like this on our side. And frankly, I don't begrudge us because it's sick to try to propagandize among young people with this stuff. So what do you do when you're dropping your kid in the middle of a world where everything is insane and where everything is about breeding left-wing activism and ignorance? We're creating activists and idiots, useful idiots, for an agenda. And we'll talk a little bit about that agenda right after this quick break. This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton on the Buck Sexton Show. More next. This is the Buck Sexton Show, and this is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton. Happy New Year's Eve to you all, and thank you for joining me today. Follow me on Twitter at BHWeingarten. All right, before the break, we were talking a bit about poisonous ideas and the poisonous consequences they have for society. And it's very hard to kind of quantify or sum up what the impact of multiple generations of this sort of progressive thought policing has been. But I think there was a fine example of it this weekend on Meet the Press where Chuck Todd did a full episode on environmentalism. And he stated near the start of the show, and I'll quote here, "We're not going to debate climate change, the existence of it. The Earth is getting hotter, and human activity is a major cause, period. We're not going to give time to climate deniers. The science is settled, even if political opinion is not," unquote. That's a very scientific attitude there by Chuck Todd, because after all, we know exactly how much human beings have contributed to warming. We know for a fact that this isn't just one of the another million historical cycles that there have been in terms of temperature. We know that temperature is climate. They're exactly the same thing. He's so confident in his position that anyone who would deign to present some countervailing evidence, shut up. And by the way, we're going to call you climate deniers, which is a pretty offensive kind of term because when you hear deniers used, what does that usually bring up? Well, it's Holocaust deniers. Chuck Todd is smart enough to know that he probably shouldn't be using that phrase to describe anyone who would challenge a view that is not unanimously held. Look up the 97% of climate scientists all agree statistic, and it's a bogus statistic. So then he had Jerry Brown on, the California governor, and Jerry Brown said this about climate change. At first, he was talking about the challenge from China and then climate change. So I want to put this in context here. He said, and I quote, "Instead of worrying about tariffs, I'd like to see the president and the Congress invest tens of billions in renewable energy, in more efficient batteries to get us off fossil fuel as quickly as we can." Well, they really love this in France, the Green Vest. He goes on, "I would point to the fact that it took late President FDR many, many years to get America willing to go into World War II and fight the Nazis." And He continues here, well, we have an enemy, though different, but perhaps very much devastating in a similar way. And we've got to fight climate change, and the president's got to lead on that. So what I want to understand is he saying that fighting something that may or may not be transpiring in the environment that human beings may or may not have a disproportionate impact on is the equivalent of fighting the Nazis? Or is he comparing the Chinese to the Nazis? I'm not quite sure where he's going with that analogy. But let's sum up what this really is. Climatism is a secular religion, or at least it is a sect in the progressive secular religion, and the state is their church. What is climate change really about for them? It's about sort of, in some sense, justifying mass redistribution of wealth. It's about apologizing for our Western sins of being industrialized and therefore redistributing the fruits of it to the first and third world nations. It's a form of elite virtue signaling. It's very easy to say I care about the environment and then go trotting around on a jet. You don't really have to deal with the consequences or take responsibility. And oh, by the way, there's also the self-interested aspect of this, which is that those who promote this vision oftentimes are the very people who end up personally benefiting from government investments, the Greens, more Solyndras. Well, if Solyndras all over the country, if these people are the ones who are allowed to dominate. Ultimately, though, what progressivism is about, as I mentioned, is a secular religion. It is about dominance, and the way that you instill that dominance is to propagate these messages starting with little children, starting with toddlers, and working all the way up through college. And how are you going to be able to compete against that when all you have is the real world?